Hello, bonjour, ni hao, willkommen, and greetings in all other languages to our guests and viewers from around the world. Thank you for joining us at the 17th hour of the 24 Hours of STEM event. My name is Priya, and I am part of FRC Team 503 Frog Force from the eastern part of the United States. We hope you have enjoyed the presentations and events so far on the other 24 hours of STEM streams. Now, it is our pleasure to be hosting presentations on the energy stream for the next 2 hours. So let's get on with the presentations. Most of us have had experience with virtual learning, whether it be school learning for younger students or office meetings for adults. In all these activities, we have faced some ups and downs. The goal of our next presentation is to show us how the presenters and their team navigate the ups and downs of remote learning to teach programming. Without further ado, let's welcome our first presenters of the hour, Brett and Jonah from FRC Team 6328, Mechanical Advantage from Littleton, Massachusetts. They will be teaching about programming remotely with inexpensive home robots. Presenters, when you're ready, you can start.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Teaching Programming Remotely with Inexpensive Home Robots, presented to you today by Team 6328, Mechanical Advantage from Littleton, Massachusetts. A little bit about us. We are a community team based in Massachusetts. We currently have about 30 students on our team. Our rookie season was 2017, and we draw from a number of area, communities, and schools. Your presenters today will be myself, Brett Bonner. I am a software and controls mentor for the team. Jonah, our software student lead, and Ayush, our marketing student lead and a programming student for the team. The key question that we'll be addressing today is this: how can we deliver engaging training to teach programming students fundamental software and controls skills when we can't meet in person? A little background to start. Or fully remote, now what? So, like all teams, 2020 was a rough year. We were lucky enough to play one event before the rest of the season was canceled, but then all work paused for a few months. In the meantime, though, we had a great group of students coming up in the programming team. For 2021, we have a new programming lead. That's Jonah, who has a strong emphasis on teaching. And we have a strong team of other students, but most of them are relatively new to programming. Some had worked on the robot code last year, but not in a lot of depth. So this means we have lots of teaching opportunities, and after all, that's what we're here for. In addition, on 6328, students have a team training requirement, and it's up to us as mentors and leads to provide opportunities for them to meet that requirement. Thinking about our software sub-team, we identified 3 separate areas of need. Obviously, there's some overlap between them. First, we have programming fundamentals. This is all of the basics, so things like conditionals, variables, loops, classes and objects, and just general best practices for how to do quality, maintainable programming. Next, we have robotics and control theory concepts, things that would apply to any type of robotics, including PID control, event loops, and using various kinds of sensors. Finally, we have FRC specific skills. These are the things that really are specific to the environment that we work in FRC, including WPI-lib, network tables, command-based robot code, controller APIs, and the like. So given all of those needs, how do we not just teach them remotely, but do it well? And of particular concern, how do we maintain student engagement in this environment? I think we would all agree that the best learning is hands-on, but so much of robot software is about interacting with the hardware. So we asked ourselves the question, what can students safely do at home? Our hopefully not so crazy scheme was, what if every student had their own robot at home? If this was the case, we could develop a series of fun weekly challenges that covered the core concepts we needed to, were escalating in complexity as the students learned they could do more complicated challenges. We could deliver this through regular video meetings and have plenty of support channels where we could help support the students and they could work with one another as though they were meeting in person. But if we were going to do this, the first question was, is there a suitable robot that we could use for the job? So we began to look. Our initial criteria were that it had to be small, safe for home use, inexpensive enough that the team could purchase around a dozen of them to give to students and mentors to work with. Most important, it needed to be capable of using real controls. It needed to have encoders. It needed a gyro. It needed other sensors that we could work with, just like we do on the bigger robots. Ideally, we'd like that it could run FRC code as well, but we knew that that was going to be a tall order going into this. There were some things we ruled out right off the bat. One was real FRC robots. We simply don't have enough of them. They're much too big and powerful for students to run in houses, and they're just too complex and too risky to operate, particularly by students who weren't very experienced with them to begin with. We found some expensive trainers that were on the market, but they were out of our price range. And we found lots and lots of cheap toy robots, and many of these were little more than an Arduino and a couple of servo motors, and that wasn't going to be adequate to meet our teaching needs. So we knew we were going to have to make some trade-offs. We couldn't find a robot that met all of the criteria and could run FRC code, but we discovered there were lots of Arduino-based options that were out there. So we began to ask, can that work? It would mean that we would be teaching the students in C and C++ instead of Java, and we are a Java team. But we also thought that it would be simpler to get the students started with these because they didn't need to understand all of the aspects of WPILib that they needed on the real robot. We didn't really want to teach the students using the Arduino editor. It's very basic and it's pretty different from the experience of programming for FRC. But we knew that we could use VS Code to do Arduino development with a suitable extension. So our decision was that an Arduino-based solution would be acceptable. And this is the robot that we chose. It's from a company called Pololu, and it's called the Zumo 32U4. As you might guess from the name, it's based on an Arduino 32U4 microcontroller. It is available pre-assembled. This was important since we needed a dozen of them. And it has all of the sensors that we wanted. It has wheel encoders that are reasonably accurate. It has a gyro and accelerometers. It has proximity sensors. As a nice bonus, it has its own little display, buttons, and LEDs, which made it more interactive. Price-wise, it lists for $150, and when we reached out to Pololu, they were willing to sell it to us for $125 with a special FRC discount. And as a footnote there, they've said that that would be offered to other FRC teams on request as well. This is a very small robot. It's only about 10 centimeters square, and it's powered by just 4 AA batteries, so it's very suitable for home use. Having chosen a robot, now we needed to think about how we would actually deliver this training. So the first question was, what would the development environment look like? And as previously mentioned, we chose to use VS Code for consistency with FRC development. Several students were already familiar with that as an environment. It is a far more capable editor than the Arduino one, and we wanted the students to become familiar with its capabilities. And we knew that it had an Arduino extension, which relies on the Arduino IDE toolchain underneath. This actually proved to be beneficial because some of the other Arduino tools, such as the serial monitor, also proved to be useful during the training. Thinking about how our materials would get to students, we decided to distribute our challenges through GitHub. We would provide a README file that was the description of the challenge, and all of the template code that they would need to do the work would be distributed just as a simple zip file that they could download from the GitHub website and unzip onto their computer. We chose not to address teaching Git from the beginning because we felt that that would be a barrier and too much complexity for an introductory course. Everybody gets a robot. Having made all these choices, it was time to order robots. And so we placed a single bulk order for the team and loaned the robots out to students. We offered students the option to purchase their own robot as part of that, and several of them took advantage of that. In terms of what else was needed, we decided that our challenges would, wherever possible, use common household materials that students would be able to access readily. We did print a few large format materials. So we did things like a maze challenge at one point, and that was a 3x4 foot maze that we printed on the team's large format plotter and distributed to students. We had tried for an earlier line following challenge to have the students print out small pieces of paper and tape them together. And the feedback was that that was more of an arts and crafts project than a programming challenge, so we chose not to repeat that. In addition to the robots, we included a small remote control, which you can see pictured in the slide as well. And we used this in several challenges. You'll hear a little bit about that later on. One lesson learned, we didn't include USB cables for programming the robots, but we really should have, and we would do that when we run the course again. Several students either didn't have cables or had cables that didn't work, and that created unnecessary problems for us. Our training cadence was primarily weekly. We would release new challenges on Sunday. The students would have 4 days to work through them, with an introductory meeting on Monday to go over the challenge, and a review meeting on Thursday to go through the solution, with a few days in between, either to catch up or as a break between them. This pace seemed to work pretty well for our team, but obviously it could be adapted based on the needs of the particular students and the time frame in which it's delivered. In terms of student interactions and support, 6328 uses Slack heavily already, so our primary interactions were through a Slack channel. We would post announcements, we asked students to share their results, which was usually videos of their Zoomos doing cool things, and we also used Slack to carry out one-on-one calls with students as needed for support. Students or leads and mentors scheduled office hours during which anyone who wished to could join for assistance, support, environment problems, whatever it might be, we would work through with them. The use of that varied from time to time, and it's something that we would probably think through how we would approach the next time. We posted recordings of our Monday and Thursday Zoom calls on the team's Google Drive so that students could access them. This was another lesson learned. We didn't do that at the very beginning of the program, but we should have. It proved to be very valuable both for asynchronous learning in the event that a student couldn't make it to a meeting, and for review, where a student wanted to go back and hear an explanation again about how something was meant to work.
So now we're going to move into talking about some of the specific course challenges we provided to students. In total, there were 11 of them, so unfortunately we don't have time to talk about them all, but we're going to go over some highlights and hopefully some valuable lessons learned from each one. The first one I want to talk about is Challenge 3, which we called Coming Through. So the purpose of this challenge was to have the robot autonomously navigate around a room. So this is using one of my favorite sensors on the Zoomo, the proximity sensors. And there's a little diagram of them on the left there. The yellow arrows show infrared LEDs, and the white arrows are infrared sensors. So the way this works is we send out IR pulses on the LEDs. Those are reflected off objects, and we can sense them on the 3 sensors, left, front, and right. And using different combinations of LEDs and sensors, you can detect objects in different directions. So for example, combine the right LEDs with the right sensor, and you can see an object to the right. So there's a whole bunch of data that's coming in to the robot about all of the objects surrounding it. And here I have a little video to show what that might look like. So this was put together by the mentors as an example. And you can see we're gliding smoothly around the edge of the room using the proximity sensors. So this represents one possible approach to this problem, one possible solution, but there are lots of ways to accomplish this. We had a very general goal, autonomously navigate a room. So given the wealth of different solutions you could have to a challenge like this, the question is then, how did we present it to students? So for all of our challenges, we started with providing template code, which students would load onto the robot. And I want to take a look at that for this challenge because there are a few key things to point out here. So you can see here, we have a setup function and a loop function. So this will be familiar to anyone that has written Arduino code. Looking through here, you can also see there's a lot of commenting. We're going through literally line by line and explaining what everything does. This is far more than we would normally include in our code. But that means that a student who is still at a fairly beginner level can read through this and with a little bit of time, understand what everything is doing. Now, this piece here at the start of the loop is particularly important. So what this is doing is it's reading the values from the proximity sensors and it's displaying all of them on the LCD. This is something that we did for a lot of these challenges that involved sensors, right? Because we can spend a while explaining the gyro sensor, the proximity sensors, or the accelerometers, but what we found is it's far more valuable to students if they just are able to play around with the sensors, experiment. The proximity sensors, you're getting 6 data points back from different combinations of sensors and LEDs. But if you just move your hand around the robot while this code is running, you get a fairly intuitive sense of what it's reading. So that worked pretty well. And down at the bottom, we have the start of a solution to this challenge. So if you press the A button, there were a couple of physical buttons on the robot, it would start to drive forward. And once it detected an object in front of it, it would come to a stop. So obviously that's not completing the full challenge, but it's planting the seed of a solution. Right? And so you could imagine a student building off of this into a full solution. And we think that providing this initial code makes it less intimidating to start to build off of it. Right? So for example, here they already have example code for detecting an object in front of the robot. Even if this isn't how it responds, that's still a useful piece of code. So in order to build off the template code towards a full solution, we can take a look at our challenge overview. So in addition to the template code, each challenge included a document like this, which provided step-by-step instructions for how to get started with the challenge. And in particular, I want to take a look at this section here. So we wanted to maintain flexibility as students were solving this challenge. As I say, there are lots of ways you can solve it. So this is what we chose to do. For students that want it, they can pull down these little sections and get some hints that move them towards a solution to the challenge. So this first approach, maybe instead of stopping when we hit a wall, we could try and find a new direction. We can build up and get more advanced. So maybe it could respond differently depending on how far away that object is. At the highest level, now let's take the values from the encoders and do some math on it to figure out the motor speed. So really take advantage of all of the granularity of the data we're getting. And you can see here that we're not telling them a specific solution. We're being intentionally vague so that students still have an opportunity to figure things out on their own, experiment, and come up with unique solutions. So let's take a look at how well that worked. We have another video here, same challenge, but this was from a student. And you can see here, what the robot is doing is entirely different to the first video we looked at. Right? We're taking these simpler turns and driving straight between them. So this is a solution that we never showed. Right? We provided those hints, we provided the template code, but we didn't say create that. And that also points to another key benefit of having an openness in how a student can solve a problem. it means that we can tailor to a student's individual skill level. So this solution is on the simpler side. And as a student becomes more advanced, they can build and create more and more complex solutions. Right? So that way, it's a beginner student can solve the challenge, can accomplish something, but a more advanced student can really push themselves. Okay. I want to move on to the next challenge here, challenge 6, following orders. So as Brett said, we included a small remote control with all of the Zumos. And the goal of this challenge was to use that remote control to send commands to the robot. And ultimately, we wanted to be able to drive the robot around with the arrow buttons on the remote. Now, this challenge was a particularly difficult one, and there are a few reasons for that. So first of all, decoding the transmission protocol involves the use of a state machine, right, which is a more advanced programming concept. But a state machine is something that's really important to a lot of FRC code. So we had this in mind from the start. We thought this was going to be a valuable challenge because of that. But in order to make that work, you also need to understand how to decode the transmission protocol. It's fairly complicated. It's a series of infrared pulses. And we would have to explain how that works and figure out what the process is to decode it. The last piece is the data that is being sent through that protocol is a series of binary bits. So in order to understand what message is being sent, you also need to have a basic understanding of binary. And all three of these things are fairly complicated. You can imagine building entire challenges around each of them. So we had to figure out what is most important for us to teach, what's most valuable, and maybe even more importantly, what can we reasonably expect students to accomplish? Remember, each of these students are working on over the course of only about 3 days. So here's how we answered that. We felt that state machines were really the most important concept here. We really wanted to focus student work on building a state machine. We thought that was most valuable because of its applicability to FRC code. Decoding the transmission protocol we thought was less important. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to generalize. It's really very specific to this application. So for example, we never would control the FRC robot with an infrared controller. And the last piece, understanding binary, is certainly more generally applicable than decoding the transmission protocol. But we realized that binary could be a potential trouble spot for students that had not been exposed to it before. And we wanted to avoid students getting stuck on the binary, on figuring that out, and less focused on, say, the state machines. We didn't want to cause frustration. So I want to take a look again at the challenge overview in the template code to see how this was reflected. So here, I want to point out, with all of these challenges, we have a list of prerequisites. So this is a little bit longer here. And so here we first have links off to information on the IR transmission protocol and IR transmission in general. So this is something where for students that were interested, they can really dive in and try and understand this, but everyone gets at least a basic overview. Right? Next, we have a video explaining binary, same idea. Students get an overview, and the ones that are interested can really dive in. And this last bit, we have tutorials on switch statements and enumerations. So this is a common theme. Often these challenges will involve more basic programming concepts that students just haven't been exposed to before. We don't want to spend a lot of time emphasizing teaching those, but we provide resources here so students can at least understand what they're looking at. And further down, we can see the key part of this challenge. So we provide to students this state diagram. So that outlines the structure of the state machine they'll be building. And then here, this is the infrared transmission protocol. And we've shown how all of the states in the state machine match up with that. So the combination of those two things means we are telling students how to decode the transmission protocol. Right? They don't have to look at this series of pulses and figure out, what sequence the robot should go through to decode it. We've done that for them. So we're de-emphasizing decoding the transmission protocol. But what is really important is the state machine, right? So the challenge, what we were really trying to focus student work on, was taking this state diagram that we've created and turning it into a state machine in code. And so let's take a look at the template code too, so we can see how that works. So this template is obviously a little more complicated than for challenge 3, but we still have the same setup function, loop function. And right here is a switch statement. So what we're looking at here is the outline of the state machine. So we've already created the general structure of how that works. But what students have to do is fill in the blank, right? And here we can see we have hints for each possible state of what code should be added. We aren't telling them the answer, but students are really focused on looking at this template code and comparing it to the state diagram in order to finish it off. And while we're here, I also want to show this function. So write bit. After students decode a single binary bit from the series of IR pulses, they can put it into this function. So they just need to give a position and a value for that bit, and we handle modifying it in the variable they provide. So students don't even have to understand necessarily what that binary bit means. All that they have to do is give it to us and we handle the rest. So we are de-emphasizing the importance of understanding binary. And of course, for students that were interested, we were available to talk about what all of the bitwise operators in this line do and how binary works. But we're making it less intimidating for the more beginner students. So the key thing here is we were prioritizing, we were focused on what we thought was most important to teach students. Okay. The next challenge I want to talk about is lookup. So here, this is another example from the mentors. And the goal here was to make the robot face up on a tilted surface. And that was using the accelerometers. We can also talk about here, the challenges we put together generally fell into sort of two types. The first type is like challenge 3 that we looked at, where we were trying to allow students to figure out something for themselves, to come up with a new solution. And so we provided general hints. We were intentionally vague about what students were accomplishing. And so that way we're encouraging problem solving, we're encouraging creativity, and we think there's a lot of value to challenges like that. This is approached in a slightly different way. So this video is what we provided to students. And we said, essentially, recreate this. That was the goal of the challenge. And so we are providing a clear example. And the reason we found that valuable is that it allowed us to focus on more specific skills. And we'll talk about what those are in a moment. But that was choosing which one of those to go with for any challenge really just depended what we were trying to teach. Were we trying to teach more general problem solving, or were we trying to really focus in on specific skills? So as I say, this is using the accelerometers. So this challenge was really the first introduction we gave students to the accelerometers. And we thought that was important because they are occasionally useful in FRC programming. And the accelerometer, this is a 3-axis accelerometer. So we have an X, Y, and a Z axis. And one of the first problems students had to solve here was figuring out which of those values is important to solving this challenge. Which one should you be looking at to know if you're facing uphill? And we really like this because it's a very simple, focused problem-solving exercise. Right? And also, you can solve it in multiple different ways. And those solutions are of different complexity. So you can start with only a single value, and you might find that that works, but if the robot is facing downhill, it may not be able to distinguish that. More advanced students can combine together multiple values in order to create a much more reliable system, but we can tailor to the skill level of the student. So that was really valuable. The other thing we were able to focus on teaching with this challenge was control systems. So the template code that we provided had a simple on-off control system. So that meant that it would turn until it reached the target and then it would stop. And this is a really good example of where that doesn't work, because as you tilt the surface, the target is constantly moving. So you'll end up with a lot of oscillation or you won't quite reach the target. So this challenge was a really good practice of proportional control. So this is a more advanced control system where you slow down as you approach the target. And proportional control is something that came up in a lot of these challenges. You'll see that many of them are essentially just different applications of proportional control. The reason for that is that we think proportional control is a really fundamental concept to a lot of FRC code, and it's a more advanced concept. So this program was a really good way to focus on making sure that all students had a good foundational understanding of control systems like proportional control. And so here we have one example of trying to do that. Okay. Next, we're going to continue on the using fun sensors path, challenge 5 and challenge 8. And we'll talk about why those are two challenges in a moment. So the goal here was to try to maintain orientation on a rotating surface. This is another video from the Mentos. And you can see here, rotating robot is nicely tracking the same direction using the gyro sensor. So we knew right from the start that maintaining orientation would be a really good practice of proportional control. Like the previous challenge, that meant you had a constantly shifting target. Proportional control was really valuable. But there was a problem, because the gyro we're using here returns only an angular velocity. It doesn't convert it to position automatically, like sensor in FRC, for example, the NavX. Now, even if you're using a NavX in FRC, we realized that knowing how a gyro integrates velocity to calculate position was valuable background. But that's a more advanced skill. So we wanted to teach proportional control using the position, and that's a more beginner skill. And we wanted to teach integrating, but that's a more advanced skill. But in order to do the proportional control, it would appear we would have to do the integrating before that. So we were stuck here. We were trying to figure out how we get the best of both worlds there. And the answer, like many of these programming problems, it seems, is abstraction. So we took this and we split it up into two different challenges. Challenge 5, the earlier challenge, was focused on proportional control. So we wrote all of the code that integrated the gyro, and we provided it to students. All that they had to do was interact with a simple API to retrieve the position. We also used this as an opportunity to introduce students to the gyro sensor and what that was. And their work, what they were doing, was focused on writing the control system, writing proportional control. So another good practice of that. For the later challenge, challenge 8, it was the same goal, but we did it without our template code. Students had figured out everything else, so all they had to do was focus on writing the code to integrate the gyro to convert velocity to position. And what we learned from all of this is at beginner levels, splitting up complex problems is really key to keeping the work engaging. Right? So the reason for that is that being able to split up a complex problem is really a skill on its own, and it's a more advanced skill at that. So at the beginner levels, we tried to split up complex problems wherever we could. So for example, with challenge 3, we provided those 4 different approaches. So we stepped through solving that challenge for students that weren't ready to break it up on their own. And over time, we could move to allowing students to do more complex problem solving on their own. So the very last challenge that we did was very open-ended, and Ayush will tell you more about that. This lesson about splitting up complex problems was something that we had to learn very quickly at the start of the program. Right, we had to figure out how much can we provide to students, how much should we provide to students versus how much should we let them figure out. And it took us a little bit to sort of calibrate for how much we could push our particular group of students. And that will change depending on who you're working with. So for our last couple of challenges, I will turn this over to Ayush.
Okay, so the next challenge we're going to talk about is Challenge 9, Escaping the Babeland. The goal was to navigate through the maze as shown on the right. So your robot would start at the bottom right and it would have to go to the black square on the top left. The code for the line following and the turning was previously provided, and line following was part of a previous challenge that we already wrote. The goal of this challenge was to design an algorithm to decide which turns to take to get through the maze. This is the video that I created to complete this challenge. The path I took was every time the robot had an opportunity to turn left, it would, then it would go straight, then right, and then backwards. That was the kind of series that it took to go through the maze. And you can see that when it gets to the end, it stops. So this is my perspective on the challenge. I thought this was harder than most challenges. The basic code of the challenge was already given, and that simplified it to writing code for the specific skill level. The other challenges built off of this challenge. I already talked about the preceding line follower challenge, and there was also a challenge after wherein the robot had to take through the maze again, but it had to take the optimal path where it wouldn't hit dead ends like it did in the video. Overall, this gave an effective introduction on the concepts, and now I'm learning this on the real FRC code. So at the end of the programming training, we had a mini competition called the Robot Sumo. So it's a sport in which 2 or more robots compete to push each other out of a ring. The Sumo is mini sumo size and competes in a 30-inch circle. We used a white circle with a black border. The students could program using whatever strategy they liked, using the detecting the black line and turning away. There are multiple strategies that you can employ, such as avoiding your opponents or trying to push them out of the circle. So both robots start on the line. The winner is the last one that's in the ring. We had a delayed start in the template code so that you could back away from the robot. Different strategies, as I already talked about. You can go offensive, where you try to find your robot and push it out, or you can play defensive, where you try to avoid your opponent altogether. And multiple people had different programs where they would switch it between rounds to play offense or defense. This was a lot of fun for students and mentors. We originally had an intention to run an elimination bracket, but quickly we realized this was just for fun. We used FLL tables to catch the falling robots. This was a video that one of the students on the team created.
And if you see, we have a dozen Zumos over here, and all the people you see have learned how to program them. 3, 2, 1, go!
So up next, Brett will talk about the conclusions and lessons learned.
Thanks, Ayush. So I think the most important takeaway from this whole thing was that this worked. We had students gain real skills coming out of it. The Zumo proved to be capable enough to enable real, meaningful controls training, as we had hoped. And as we've moved into FRC coding in the fall, this background has really been invaluable because everyone is starting from a good base of understanding. The simplicity of the Zumo is also a really good thing. You can get started with very little code. There's very little complexity involved. And this gets students up and running very quickly, which is a huge benefit for a course like this. Bottom line, when you can't be in your workspace, this is much better than just having video calls and trying to talk through concepts. 6328 believes in sharing. Our curriculum is posted publicly. The link is on the slides here, and it's available through our website. Additionally, we've set up an email address for remote learning, and we're happy to answer any questions or get any comments through that. That will go to the creators of this program. So we'd love to hear from you if you have any input. A few recommendations based on our experience. One is to expect to put a fair amount of time into helping with environment setup. Students will run into difficulties here. No matter how good your setup instructions are, everyone's computer is a little bit different, and we kept running into things we hadn't seen before. So just plan for that up front and try to get environments set up before you're starting to try to really write code. Use cooperation to build engagement. So a little healthy competition is fun for everybody. It's worth considering even offering prizes for select competitions. As an example, for our line following challenge, we offered a gift certificate to the local ice cream shop, and that prompted some healthy competition as students tried to tune their robot code in order to make it through the course as fast as possible, and kept posting new videos where they got slightly faster, which was a lot of fun to see. And finally, don't expect perfect engagement. As good as we feel this course was, we found that we still had the greatest success with students who were already software focused. We did have some students from other sub-teams that gave it a try, and we always encourage that because part of FRC is trying things out to see what works. But we found that the software-oriented students really were the ones who took to this the best. And unsurprisingly, expect students to be working last minute. So we found that we would get a lot of questions within the hour before our review meeting. And that's unsurprising, just something you should anticipate going in. Some future directions. So the Zumo, as we've said, is a really capable little robot, and there's certainly a lot more we could do with it. We could develop more challenges. We could extend the curriculum to go deeper. As Jonah mentioned, we had a lot of optional, more challenging, more advanced work that students could do. And you could extend that even further. So as one example, our team's previous programming lead worked with us briefly when we were developing this. And he quickly developed a complete velocity closed loop control system for the Zumo drivetrain. And that enabled some additional sorts of demonstrations of capability. That's the kind of thing we could absolutely incorporate, even though we didn't have time to do it in the 12 weeks or so that we spent on this. Just a note here, we are considering making solution code available. All of the challenges and template code are posted, but right now we do not have solution code posted publicly. That's something that we're going to continue to look at in the background, and if there's more demand for it, that may be something that we provide. And lastly, another mentor prototyped adding a Bluetooth interface onto the Zumo with some inexpensive additional hardware, and then wrote a phone app to control the robot through it. So this opens a whole another avenue of possibilities for other types of things that we could do with these robots. Thank you for listening today. We hope this has been valuable. And at this time, we'd like to take any questions that anyone might have.
So thank you, Brett, Jonah, and Ayush for providing this very interesting and information-packed presentation. So I personally enjoyed this presentation very much, and I know that our viewers also enjoyed this presentation. So now we'll just go on to some questions that we have. So the first question we have is that, like, how does the Zumo program compare to the Romy robot that first just began introducing support for?
Thanks, that's a really good question. So at the time that we developed this program, the Romy solution didn't really exist. That's something that's just coming out now. The robots are actually very similar. They're in fact made by the same company. Pololu makes the Romy as well. The main difference is one of approach. So with the Romy solution, the code actually runs in an FRC simulator on a computer. And there's a simple WebSocket connection out to the robot, which just follows commands that it's given. So the advantage here is that it runs FRC code. The disadvantage is that it's more complex. And the solution right now, my understanding is less mature, particularly when it comes to sensor support. So this is something we'll be watching closely. I think that both approaches have value depending on the needs of the students and the team. And we might even explore whether it would be possible to use a similar kind of approach with the Zumos. That was something that we've just begun to talk about. So we'll see where that takes us.
Thank you. And our next question is going to be for Ayush. So you were a student that was like learning to program. So how well did this approach help you to learn in this virtual setting?
I would say it helped me to learn a lot of the basic concepts. So I know like the office hours helped me a lot, and especially like sometimes I had one-on-ones or like a two-on-one with like a mentor, and I could like run through my code if I ran into like specific difficulties, and that really helped me a lot to learn.
Okay, and I saw your video of the line following program, and I thought it was very good. So the question I want to ask you is that, do you think so you said it was like an algorithm that you would decide whether to turn left or right. Do you think you may be able to incorporate AI or artificial intelligence to make those decisions?
Currently, I think that's a little bit too advanced for me, but as I learn more, I think that's definitely possible.
Okay, sure. And so our next question was going to be, so this program was designed with the intention to run remotely. So if it was to be done again in the future without restrictions, is there any differences or changes you would make to the system?
Well, I think the key thing that was hard to recreate effectively remotely was collaboration, not just between students and mentors, but among students as well. It's really hard if we're not there to encourage students and allow students to work together, find solutions on their own. So in person, I could see definitely working on these challenges in small groups or in partnerships. And that might also mean students can work to push themselves to try some of the more advanced solutions.
Yep. And this one is from one of our viewers, and it's more like a hardware question, I guess. It says, did you have any students that did not have access to Windows-based computers because they have some Mac and Chromebook users?
So setting it up on a Mac is absolutely possible. In fact, that was what I was using throughout all of this. So Macs are definitely not a problem. Chromebooks are more difficult. Our current environment setup, I don't believe would work on a Chromebook. You might have to find more creative solutions, but we have not looked into that at this time.
Thank you. And another question was going to be that, so the challenges that you created for the students, were they provided by the robot vendor themselves, or did you guys come up with it?
That's a great question as well. So all of the challenges were things that we created. All of the template code was written by Jonah. Many of the challenges were inspired by either demo code or videos that we had seen of things that demonstrated what the Zumo was capable of. So we would see a video, for example, of actually the look up challenge was a good example of that. We had seen a demonstration of the robot carrying that out and went, oh, that would be a really fun challenge. And we selected things that would work towards teaching a particular skill. right? So that was one that we knew would be a good lesson in using proportional control effectively. So we selected that. There were other demos of the robot doing things that weren't really relevant for things we were trying to teach, so we wouldn't incorporate that. But all of the content that is available as part of the courses are things that we developed, yes.
Thank you. So I think that wraps up with the Q&A session. So once again, I thank Brett, Jonah, and Ayush for like putting your time into this presentation to like inform the viewers about like how to like effectively learn programming even in this like virtual setting. So I hope you guys like a good season for the 2021 FRC season, and thank you guys for coming to present.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So right now, since we have a little bit time left until our next presentation, we'll be going on to a small video. It's going to be like a 5-minute video. Joshua, we cannot hear the audio.
But let's not. Let's finish this off with a couple of activities called Hello World. So my Can You challenge is, can you go STEM? Go STEM. With Lego, cardboard, and Python. Now in FIRST Robotics, coding of robots is essential, and there's many different languages to use.
So guests and viewers, we're having a small technical difficulty, so just please hang on with us. Thank you.
But let's not. Let's finish this off. Challenge is, can you go STEM? Go STEM. with Lego, cardboard, and Python. Now in FIRST Robotics, coding of robots is essential, and there's many different languages to use. At Whimsy, when we're introducing students to computer science, we'll use tools such as Scratch, and we'll use tools such as Python, which is very readable as you go through. Forgive the Minecraft noises in the background. Hold on, I gotta fix this. Because I'm, all right. Oh dear. Well, the cat's out of the bag on that one. Let me quit that. That was gonna be a demo. Let's see if we can pull that one off. I spawned a bunch of dogs with Python in Minecraft. Okay, so Python. So we're gonna program with Python. The first place we'll go, and let me share my screen, is, did that work there? Can we see this? Do I have confirmation that we can see this? I'm hoping we can. Amanda, can we see this? No. Stop share. Let me try one more time. I got all this time, you know. I'm getting a little lackadaisical here. So, oh, you could see it. Oh, let's try again. Share again. Oh, we're good. Okay. Whew. All right. So we're gonna go into a program on the computer itself, and let's make this bigger, 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 bigger. Go big. And so on any computer you have, you can get Python on that computer. And on my computer, I just go into the terminal program and I type Python. And I say print go stem. And it says go stem. Let's have it print go stem 10 times. This is cool. It's going to use a for loop for x in range 10. I think I said 10. I hope it said 10. We're going to tab over and we're going to say print go stem 10 times. Okay, so hello world tasks in any programming language is find the programming language you need, load the resources, and write your first program. And in this case, we wrote our first program, Go Stem. Well, Python as a program can be used to work with other devices. So we've got here a Spike Prime kit. So Lego Robot, Mindstorms, long history there, working with FIRST and other groups in education. And if I do, actually, let me do a new activity, and I'm going to do Python here, and I'm going to say test. I'm going to spell it correctly. Well, I got 2 minutes. I think I can pull this off. So they already built their hello world into this, and if I press run, I get a smile. Well, let me try my Go Stem. So I'm going to say hub light matrix right Go Stem, and let me run that there. Well, I think I got time. And Go Stem. Now in this one, I'm going to go back to my pre-baked program here, and we're going to try to end in the last minute here with our 15th activity. And I'm going to put this Go Stem here, and we're going to run this program, which has the loop in it. And so first, whoops, there's the Go Stem, and then my motor says Go Stem 5 times. Awesome. Well, this has been a super pleasure and honor to work with everybody on this 24 hours of STEM. And I think we did it. Congratulations, Whimsy team, fitting 15 5-minute STEM activities into 1 hour. Well done.
So hope that video was interesting for all the guests and viewers. So now we're going to be entering the 18th hour of the 24 Hours of STEM event. So let's go on and look at what the next presentation is. So how many of us have been at robotic competitions or just any other competitions? So what happens at the competitions? When we go to the competitions, we don't even have enough time to fully look at what our team is doing. But what FIRST does is FIRST creates challenges that requires us to know all about the other robots and teams. So how is this being done? The people that carry out this important task are scouters on the robotic teams. So the goal of our next presentation is going to be that the presenters are going to talk about how they and their team gather and use scouting data. Without further ado, let's welcome our next presenters for the hour, Kevin and Ludi from Team 1679 Citrus Circuits from Davis, California. They will be talking about scouting and how they connect the dots in their scouting data. Good morning, Kevin and Ludi. So when you guys are ready, you guys can start.
Alrighty, yeah. So I'm Kevin. Bit of background about me. So this is my second year on 1678. I am currently one of the two back-end scouting leadership people. So that means that I do a lot of the organization stuff behind the server. So making sure that we're prioritizing tasks correctly and figuring out just everything that has to go on. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Ludi. This is my third year on 1678, and I'm the other back-end scouting lead. I hope you enjoy this presentation.
Yep. So before we really get into things, just a quick overview for what we're going to be covering. So we're just going to be going over some of the terms that 1678 uses so that we're all using the same vocabulary. Then we're going to go through the basic calculations that we do, and also some of the things that just everyone has to do if you have scouting data. We're going to take a look at the pickability process that 1678 uses to try and speed up picklist meetings. We're going to talk about our predictions. Then we're going to go through how we analyze accuracy of our calculations, mainly at the end of the season. We're going to talk about some of the things that we've done that are specific to certain years to help shed some light on how we go about developing calculations to provide as much value as possible in a given season. And then we're going to wrap up the presentation by looking at a couple of the ways that we analyze defense. So
first off, with some basic distinctions, we have calculated data versus raw data. Raw data is the data that is directly collected by the scouts, and calculated data is everything else, data after it's been processed. There's also objective data versus subjective data. Objective data is just data about numbers, how many balls did you see this robot score. Subjective data is more of which robot do you think is the best on this alliance at doing a certain thing. So objective data is collected by our scouts, and subjective data is collected by our super scouts. We try to separate out these two kinds of data just to make it easier on our scouts. Finally, we have data from other sources, such as TBA, pit scouting, which is when we have scouts go into the robot pits and ask questions, and pre-scouting.
So yeah, we're gonna just take a quick look at some of the basic calculations that we do. So some of these can actually get reasonably complicated, but the way our system's set up, we need to do them before we can do anything else to the data. So there are some things that we just still lump in this category because it's impossible for us to really do anything without doing them. So really the first thing that we do is we have to consolidate what we get from our scouts. So 1678 is pretty unique in that it we use a lot of scouts for each match. So we have a total of 20 scouts scouting at a time, 2 super scouts who do subjective data, and then we have 18 scouts who scout objective data. And so those objective scouts are split up 3 robots on every alliance, on every robot rather. So we have a total of 18 because there are 6 robots in a match. And so the reasoning that we do this is it improves accuracy, but it also does add complexity to the calculations that we need to do, because we have 3 different scores for each match. So our first step after we get the data and turn it into something that can actually be used is we need to take these 3 scout reports and condense it into an actual useful set of data points that represent our best estimate of what actually happened in the match. So this can be tricky because obviously sometimes the scouts are going to disagree. So one of the things that we do to try and figure out what actually happened is if we have the majority of the scouts who scouted the match, so typically if we have 2 out of the 3, if 2 out of the 3 scouts agree, then we're just going to use the number that they got for a certain data point, because it's more likely that the 1 scout messed up than 2 of them messed up. If all 3 disagree, we basically just average the results. So if I have 1 scout who said the team did 2 balls in the high goal and another said it was 4 and 1 said it was 6, then we're just going to go ahead and average it all up. And so we'll end up concluding that there were 4 in the high goal for that team. So this graph is from our white paper, but we included it here just to give a visual indication of how important consolidation is to our system. So this data is from the LA North Regional, which we were fortunate enough to attend this year at the very start before everything got shut down. So you can see that at LA North, over a total of about 100 matches, we had just in one category, we had over 175 disagreements, and about 2/3 of them we were able to resolve just using the best of 3 method. So consolidation is a really crucial aspect of our system, both in preserving data accuracy, because the closer we can get to what actually happened, the better the rest of our calculations will be, but also we can't really do anything without it.
So these are some examples of the kinds of data points that we calculate. On the objective side, we calculate averages for teams. So what's the average number of balls they can score in the high goal, or what's the average amount of time that they spend in cap in a match. We also do competition-wide counts in totals, such as the number of times that each team would control the control panel in 2020 throughout the entire competition, and their total number of climb attempts. We also do success rates. One example of this is the percent of climb successes that the robot has done, which means just the number of times they have climbed that ended up being successful. On the subjective side, we have 2 normalized abilities. This year they were driver agility and driver rendezvous agility. And then we take a weighted average of them, and then that becomes our driver ability, which is just how good we think this team is at driving.
Yeah, and then again, just to stress the differences between these 2 sets of data, they're coming from 2 entirely different groups of scouts. We try to avoid having the same scouts doing objective collection and subjective collection at the same competition, just because it works a lot better for our scouts if we can train them to work fully with one app as opposed to having to work with both objective and subjective. Okay, so one of the things that we do that is probably a little more unique to our team, but we would recommend a lot of other teams should do this probably, is our use of what we call pickability metrics. So The goal of these is to speed up picklist meetings so that we don't have to spend a lot of time like figuring out even an initial list. So we can get down to actually making some of the more important decisions about like where robots are placed. So what pickability is it's basically a massive weighted average between, or not average, it's a composite metric that we make by weighting a bunch of different points. So we'll take, say, if we know that a team has a certain number of average balls in the high goal, and then we know that the high goal is worth 2 points, then we'll just go ahead and multiply that together, and that's what counts towards their pickability. So we try to weight them as much as possible to reflect impact in a match. So if there's point values associated with an action, then the action will be multiplied by the points it's worth, just to better represent how valuable it will end up being in an ELIMS match. There are also, we run 2 separate calculations for pickability as well, because we make 2 separate pick lists. So we have first choice pick list, and then we, so that's for our first pick, and then we have our second pick list. So that's for our second and third picks once we get to champs, is when the third pick comes into play. So for the first pickability, in most years, we only focus on offensive metrics because they're the only things that we really expect our first pick to be doing. In second pickability, we include whatever defensive metrics we have for that year, because typically, at least in some matchups, we're going to be having our second pick playing defense in some way, at least for some of the time. So defense in general is a lot more important for second picks. So we try and account for that in how we do our initial sorting. Obviously, pickability and all of the other complicated metrics that we calculate are never going to be perfect. But after competitions, we do try and tweak the weightings on the various categories to try and make them more accurately reflect what our final pick list ended up being like. So this is, again, is important because we're trying to reduce the total amount of time spent at pick list meetings. So if we can reduce discussion by already putting teams where they should be, that's a major win because we can reduce the amount of time, and that means everyone can get more sleep and not have to be just thinking about the pick list as much.
Now we will talk about predictions. So the goals of predictions are to predict the outcome of future matches based on the current performance of robots that we can already observe. And we also try to predict the final rankings of a competition based on current performance. Now we usually use pre-scouting data to try and predict matches, and we try to have these predictions be as accurate as possible, but they won't ever be completely perfect because data isn't perfect, teams are not consistent, so predictions will always be a little bit imperfect.
So our predictions, we do all of our predictions actually based on the data that we collect at events. So there's a bunch of different people in the FRC community who do really cool things with metrics like ELO and OPR to try and predict matches before the event. But the real strength of our predictions is that we actually have data on how well each team does in every match. So instead of trying to estimate their performance, what we can do is we can just take a look at how they've been performing and try and predict how they will perform in the future. This is still pretty hard, but it's certainly more conducive to accuracy than trying to do it based on OPR or ELO, because at least we know how well that team's done in the past, instead of trying to estimate that as well. We do the base alliance score predictions just based on how well the team does on average. So we'll take a look at like average high goals, average climb rate, and then we'll figure all that out, just whatever their average point total per match ends up being. Then we just sum that up for the entire alliance, and that's how we get our predicted score. Win-loss tie RP, we just compare the predicted scores for each alliance. So if the Red Alliance has a higher predicted score, then we decide that they will win. If it's a tie, we decide it's going to be a tie. If they lose, we decide that they don't get any ranking points. The most complicated part of the predictions work is when we're calculating the bonus RPs. So whatever it is, it's going to be based on some scouting data, but what that is will vary depending on what the RPs are. So in the last couple of years, there's been a ranking point based on doing some sort of thing for climbing. So this year, to predict the climb chance, we just figured out how likely it was that the top 2 robots would climb. We decided that essentially, because you only needed 2 robots climbing in a balanced fashion to get to the climb RP, we would only look at the top 2 robots climbing, because it was most likely that they would be the people, the teams who were actually trying to climb. Then we also used this year, because the other ranking point required both the control panel and power cell scoring. We only examined power cell scoring because the control panel just wasn't happening consistently enough in quals matches. Especially when we were looking at week 0 events, it just wasn't happening consistently enough for us to think that there was a chance of getting reliable data on how good a team was at manipulating the control panel. So we only considered how many power cells we expected an alliance to score. As we all know, that ranking point ended up not actually happening, at least for the part of the season that anyone got to play in. So it looks like that was probably the correct call. But if teams had gotten more consistent at scoring and manipulating the control panel, we might have looked to change that later on the season, perhaps for champs. The last thing that we do, especially for the ranking points, is that we model the variation in scoring using a normal distribution or t-distribution, depending on especially when in the competition it is, because once we get later in the competition, we get a larger sample size, which makes the normal distribution a little more appropriate. But in general, what that serves to do is it makes the predictions a little more robust to shifts in how well a team performs. We'll note that we only currently do that for ranking points and not for predicting the score, however.
These are some potential sources of error in predictions. The biggest one is lack of accurate metrics for defense, which can have a significant impact on a match, but it's very hard to track, especially in years such as 2020. Also, predictions don't take into account a robot's current performance. So if a team has been trending downwards, it might mean that they have some mechanical issue that'll mean that their robot is performing poorly from now on. But predictions don't really take that into account, only the team's overall performance. However, sometimes a current trend can be a much better predictor than their past performances. Also, scouts are not perfect, so a lot of times there's inaccuracy in scout data, which can affect predictions, and it doesn't take into account scoring variation when doing match score predictions.
Yeah, and the first one and the last one on this slide are particularly relevant for prediction accuracy. So for the first one, it's really hard to develop metrics for defense. We've tried on numerous occasions, and we're currently, just in the amount of time that we have in this off season and going into this build season, we're looking into ways that we can scout defense better, but we don't have it. A lot of the times, the ways that you can scout defense is really dependent on the year. So it's just defense is always going to throw off match predictions by a bit because it's inherently kind of inconsistent, and it's hard to quantify when a team is even playing defense, and then also how effective that defense was. The last point, again, is we don't have any real variation for match scores. And obviously a way around that would just be to do something similar that we do with the ranking points in terms of representing a team's performance as a distribution as opposed to just straight average. The reason we haven't done that yet is it makes the calculations a lot more complex, but again, in the amount of time that we have this offseason, we might look into implementing that to try and get more accurate predictions. We talked about using reported metrics for predictions and how a lot of people in the community use them, especially for pre-event predictions. So we're just going to go over what they are real quick. So OPR, which is offensive power rating, is a metric that's calculated using linear algebra to try and approximate how many points a robot contributes to the alliance's score on average. Essentially, it only looks at the alliance's final scores and then who is in the alliance, and then it tries to figure out across the entire competition how well robots did in every match. DPR does the same thing, but for opponent scores, which means it is really the strongest influence on it is just how strong the people you played are, which makes it a really bad indicator of how good you actually are at defense. So everyone really in the community doesn't use DPR to do much predictive power at all, because it really, the best thing it does is show how good the people you played against were on average. CCWM, which is the calculated contribution to win margin, is a combination of OPR and DPR, which makes it a little bit less useful than OPR in terms of predictive power, but it can still be used. But really, the inclusion of DPR weakens the metric. The last one that's used widely throughout the FRC community, and there have been a couple of posts on Chief somewhat recently talking about how it's better at making predictions, is ELO. So this was originally designed for chess. It only looks at wins and losses. So unlike OPR, ELO typically can't be used for trying to predict the score, because most ELO scores are based from over the span of multiple years. So it's hard to tie in win margins to a specific year's game. All of these are better than having no data to make predictions on, but in our experience, you can get a lot more accuracy in your predictions just by having real data on how well teams perform in matches. Okay. Yeah, so getting into how we analyze accuracy, this is mainly stuff that we do in the off season. So we'll take a look at how well as part of our white paper process, we'll take a look at how well teams perform, or how well our calculations perform for predicting teams' results, and then also just in general how accurate our scouts are. So this is another excerpt from our 2020 white paper. This shows the accuracy of our data at the LA North Regional. And then what we've done is we've taken this and extrapolated it out so that we have in blue, this is just if we only had one scout per robot, this is how inaccurate the data would be. So what we did is we just looked at every single scout individually and figured out how far every combination of scouts was from what the actual alliance score was. So as you can see, the error is significantly higher for one scout, especially in the most scored in data fields. So the two most frequently occurring things at LA North were the teleballs high, and auto balls high in that order. And in those data fields, the scouts were off significantly less using 3 scouts versus 1 scout. Now, this entire calculation is going to be a slight underestimate of the error, simply because there isn't a great way to know exactly which robot scored how much in a match. If there was, we wouldn't need to scout. So what we did is we took a look at our scout data and then combined it for all 3 teams on an alliance. And then we compared that to what we got from TBA as the actual number of things that happened in that match for an alliance. So if we were looking at the number of auto power cells scored in the high goal, what we would do is we would just take the sum of all the stuff for the match. So if we have 3 teams, we just take all of their values, add them up. Then we take a look at what TBA has, and then we the difference is how far off we were for that alliance. Also, this lets us examine trends in our errors. So one of the things we noticed this year is that both disagreements and the average error correlate with the frequency of the scoring. So disagreements is something that we would expect because the more times that you have robots scoring, the more chances your scouts are to disagree with each other, right? But the average error was a little more surprising to us, but we think it's because you have more stuff happening at once, so the scouts are more likely to be accurate. The last thing that analyzing our system during the off-season does is it lets us see what was working and actually have data to base that on. So from this graph here, we can pretty easily see that having 3 scouts is a lot better than 2 scouts, which is a lot better than having 1 scout for each robot. So the more scouts that we have per robot, the better. So this is just another justification for us continuing to use 3 scouts in the future once we get competitions that return to normal. Yeah, so like I said earlier, we can see that the error and the disagreements roughly are the same shape as the location, as the frequency that each location was scored in. So we can see that here. The only thing that doesn't really match this trend is that we would expect auto balls high to be higher based on its number of inaccuracies. Again, we think the reasoning is just in auto, you have so much happening at once that it's a lot easier for scouts to make mistakes.
Next, we will be talking about year-specific calculations. So one metric that was specific to this 2020 season we had was inner goals regression. So we decided early on in the season that having scouts scout whether or not a ball in the high goal went into the inner goal or just the outer goal would be too hard, because from certain angles, it's just pretty much impossible to see the inner goal. So instead, we used a regression based on TBA data for the total number of inner goals per alliance, and our scouting data for the number of high goals per team. And then we used a regression to figure out the percent of high goal shots per team that would go into the inner goal. So when we analyzed this metric, we decided it was usable, but there was still pretty high square error.
Yeah, and then again, we just like to emphasize that the math here was, it wasn't particularly complicated. It did require a bit of linear algebra, but essentially it's just the same math behind OPR. So if other teams wanted to, there are a couple of great TBA blog posts on OPR and how that's calculated. So if you want to go check them out, I would recommend. It's a great resource for learning more about that metric, but as we can see here, is also can be applied to a lot of other similar problems. Okay, so in 2019, we included pretty late in the season the pushing power metric. So after I think it was our second regional, we realized that what our system was really missing the most was we didn't have a great way to account for how strong robots were at pushing others across the field. So this caused us some issues at that regional because our second pick was had really good drivers, but one of our opponents could just push them around, which made their defense a lot less effective. So to try and counter this, we developed before champs the pushing power metric, which was essentially just a way to attempt to quantify how strong a robot was at pushing other robots compared to the rest of the competition. So we used an ELO system based on wins and losses in push battles to try and model this. So whenever a robot was able to successfully push another robot, we counted that as a win in a push battle. So over the course of the competition, obviously robots would try and push each other around, and then our scouts would record that, and that would give us a pretty comprehensive view of how basically every robot in the competition was able to respond to being pushed or was able to push other robots. So just because of the way the ELO system worked, we didn't even need robots to specifically go head to head in a push battle because we were able to extrapolate just again because of the strength of ELO. Also in this calculation, we did give greater weight for a really big win in a push battle. So if one robot just was significantly better than another one, and obviously that's a bit of a subjective call, but we were having all of the push battles being tracked by our super scouts. So essentially a big win we would give more weight to, so it would increase the robot's push ranking by more.
Some additions that we made in the 2018 season were to have a timeline of robot actions so we could track when they happened. This is because timing was especially critical in the 2018 game because it was a time-based scoring system, and the earlier that you could score, the more impact that your scoring action would have. So this timeline allows us to have an analysis of performance in different times of the match, early in the match or also later in the match. Now that scoring isn't time-based anymore, we still use the timeline to allow us to calculate cycle times. So how long a robot takes to drive across the field, intake a game piece, and then score it.
Yeah. So we're going to just go and take a quick look at some of the things we've used to measure defense now. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times defense is really dependent just on the year as well. So there aren't always great ways to just objectively measure even how long a team spends defending. So everything that we've done on this has been some parts guesswork for most years. So for a while now, our main way to estimate how good a robot will be at defense is just looking at how good their drivers are. So a lot of how good you are at defense is just going to come down to, can your driver get into certain places that are going to be really annoying for the other alliance? And that directly ties into driver skill. So we have subjective scouts who rate every alliance. So we'll have, in each quals match, we have one subjective scout for each alliance, and then they'll figure out which team was the best, the second best, and the third best at various things. So which robot was the most agile, which one was the second most agile, which one was the third most agile, for example. Then we can, like Ludi was talking about in the subjective team calculations section, we just combine all of those and normalize them based on who you were playing with. And then we can turn that into this driver ability score. So it's one main strength in measuring defensive ability is that we don't actually need teams to have played defense to figure out how good of a driver they are. So especially at some of the deeper competitions, you might not see some of the best defensive robots at a competition playing defense very much in quals, just because robots who are good at defense have good drivers. So they're typically pretty good at scoring too. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this, but in general, because of the good drivers, a good defense robot will typically be able to cycle at least reasonably well. The biggest problem with driver ability is that we can still miss out on some things that are important to defense. Again, because we aren't specifically looking at when a robot is playing defense with this metric, it can be problematic if the year requires things other than driver ability for defense. So in 2019, is why we ended up developing the pushing power metric, is that the driver ability was not strong enough at figuring out defense because pushing power was important. In 2020, that's a lot less of a thing, because the wider and more open field means that a lot more comes down to just how good your driver is at getting in the other alliance's way. So how much other things we need aside from driver ability is really year specific.
One metric that we tried in 2019 is called points prevented. So this is an approximation of the number of points that defending robots prevented their opponents from scoring. This accounted for both the cycle times that they would slow down, so if they got in the way of the opponent's robots driving and slow down their cycles, and if they caused their opponents to drop any game pieces that would make those cycles null. And we'd compare this to the average cycle time and drop rate at an event to see the difference in the number of cycles completed. And then we would take that and multiply that by the point value per cycle to figure out just about how many points that the defending robot caused the opponents to miss out on. Some of the pros of this metric were that it focuses on the actual impact of defense regardless of how the robot was doing it. So as Kevin mentioned earlier, one of the downsides of driver ability is that it couldn't take into account pushing power. However, the philosophy of points prevented is that it doesn't matter what you do or how you do it as long as you get it done. So you can see the actual impact of the defense that the robots played. However, it's harder to scout for in non-2019 games because it's much harder to tell when a robot is playing defense and what they're playing defense on. In 2019, it was easy to see because only one robot could play defense at a time. They would cross the midline and then you would know they were playing defense. But then in games such as 2020, when you have such an open field and any robot could be on defense at any time, it's a lot harder to tell. And also this can only be used on robots who have played defense, unlike driver ability. Also, because this calculation is pretty complex and it uses a set of several equations, we're not really sure how accurate it could be, and there's a lot of room for error.
Yeah, and the other issue with the accuracy is because we're really limiting it to a subset of, potentially to a subset of games where a robot played defense. If they only play defense in like 2 or 3 games, that's a really small sample size to be basing anything on. So that's another one of the concerns with this metric versus some of the others that you can just apply even if they aren't playing defense. It lets you do it over the entire competition. So the metric can better account for inconsistencies in how well a team performs. Yeah, so we're now just going to take any questions that people might have before wrapping it up.
So yeah, it looks like the first question is, where can we find more information on 1678 scouting system? So we do a white paper every year about that year's scouting system, which you can find on our website under resources. And we also do code releases on GitHub of our scouting system every year. So you can look at the code that's actually on the server, and as well as each of the apps that we use for scouting.
Yeah, and then also when we're doing the white paper release, there's also a corresponding thread on Chief Delphi, where we will answer people's questions regarding the white paper, and you can also always reach out to us at softwarescouting@citruscircuits.org, as you can you can find that and some other resources at the end of each year's white paper. Also, I would highly recommend reading past year's white papers as well, because our system hasn't changed very much. And in some of the previous years, we go into more detail depending on what was most important that year.
So that was a really informational presentation, guys. Sorry, I just had to jump in a little late due to technical difficulties. But so one question we have from the viewers is that, why don't you have each scout focus on like a particular aspect of one robot? For example, just the robot shooting in the high goal, like on a specific task, instead of having 3 robots focus on the entire robot. So like, what's your take on that?
I think the main thing is most robots will only do a couple of things in a match. So really, there isn't that much other stuff for the scouts to focus on, right? So we do have, if you were to try and split it up like that, I think that most of the time you'd really only have one scout doing stuff at a time. So it's much better to have 3 scouts who are all focusing on the same actions, because then if one of them makes a mistake, the other 2 scouts can correct that. So especially because robots can really only do one thing at a time, splitting it up it just seems you can get more accurate data when you have 3 people who are all watching, so that if one of them makes a mistake, that mistake probably isn't going to end up affecting things. We understand that that's a lot harder on the scouts, so we do have strictly enforced breaks so that scouts don't get tired and the people watching the system don't get tired. So yeah, that's my take. I don't know if Ludi has anything to add.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It just helps with data accuracy and making sure that when our scouts are looking at the same thing, we can get more accurate data.
Thank you, guys. So the next question I have is like an opinion question for both of you guys. So you talked about like different aspects of robots that you're looking at, like how well they play defense or how well they score, or like the different things. So like, based on your opinions, do you think it's better to have robots on your team that are better at defense or better at scoring?
That really depends on what role you're trying to fill. So we didn't go into it as much in this particular presentation because we were trying to focus more on the calculation aspect. But in Ethan and I, he's the scouting lead, we gave a presentation on scouting system development last night. And in that we discussed designing your scouting system around what things you're looking for in an alliance. So what that's going to end up meaning is that what we need to do is you need to consider your team's strengths and then what you're missing from that. So most FRC games will end up being something like you're probably going to want to have, in a lot of cases, the meta typically shifts to being 2 robots on offense, 1 on defense. Obviously, there have been some really successful like triple offense setups over the years, but I think that really depends just on both who's at an event and what your team's strengths are. So like if you can get a 3rd robot who's really strong on offense, or sorry, yeah, a 3rd, you might want to pick them up, especially because like we mentioned earlier, a robot who's really good at scoring is also probably going to be able to play defense because their driver's going to be good.
Yeah, this definitely does depend on what your team is strong at. You want to choose robots for your alliance that are good at things that will fit into the roles of the robots that you have determined and that will work well with your robot strengths. So I'd say this really depends on team to team. But as Kevin said, a lot of very good offensive robots are also good at defense simply because of their driving skill.
Yep. And another question from a viewer was that they were like wondering if you could repeat how you how you worked out the problems if a robot is a good performing robot, but it just happens to malfunction or has technical difficulties. How do you like decide whether or not to choose a robot or not?
Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that a lot of stuff goes into our pick list process. And so obviously it's going to be based on a lot of different considerations. And one of those is going to be reliability. So mechanical issues can be really, will tend to make, especially if they're later in the competition, mechanical issues will are kind of a red flag for us picking. But what we'll do typically is we'll, especially if it's earlier in the competition, we do look at the trends. So if you had a couple of really rough matches at the start, but have been good since, a lot of the times that'll be a mark in your favor, even if your averages are lower. And then also, if we're considering picking a team, but they've been having reliability problems, we'll typically, someone will go and talk to them about what's been happening.
Okay. And another question was that, like, at the very beginning, you were like saying you have like a lot of scouts going in. So they're saying, how many matches does each individual scout do in a competition?
I'm not sure of the exact answer for that, but we do bring in extra scouts. So we have more than 18 scouts actually, but we only have 18 scouting at a time so that we can cycle in scouts and have scouts take breaks.
Yeah. It really depends on the number of matches at a competition too. Like regionals tend to be like smaller regionals, there'll tend to be less matches, so scouts will probably scout like a couple games less. But it also, I'd probably say each scout probably ends up doing maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of the competition, somewhere in there.
Okay. And I think the last question that we have from the viewers is that, how do you figure out what your specific calculations are useful?
A lot of that is going to be, we recommend that you will talk to the people who are doing the match strategy after competitions. So if they just didn't use a data point at all, it probably didn't end up being useful for them, right? Also, another thing we consider is accuracy. So especially at the end of each season, we'll take a look at the accuracy for calculations. If that question was more centered around at the start of the season, how do we figure out what we're doing? That really comes down to the analysis that we do at the start of the season. So again, we work with the strategy sub-team and the people who are doing the match strategy just to figure out like what data do we actually, is there anything that you think you would want to know about this game? And then we'll try and figure out ways to deliver that. But it really comes down to just like stuff that the strategists want, and then we'll try and deliver that for them.
Yeah, it's really, really important for the people working on the scouting system to very closely communicate with the strategy sub-team. And in fact, a lot of people on the strategy sub-team are also people who work on the scouting system. There's a pretty big overlap in our team. But because the strategists are the kind of main end users of the data, it's really important that you can communicate with them to get them what they want.
I think that's the last question of our Q&A session, and it wraps up. So, like, first of all, I'd like to thank you guys for waking up early, because California, it's like a lag of 3 hours. on the first day of winter break. So we thank you for putting the effort and like coming to the talk and like inform the viewers on the scouting. So yeah. So like from on behalf of Frog Force, we hope you guys have a wonderful 2021 FRC season.
I'm seeing one more question in the Slack. It's the, have you thought of other ways to calculate DPR1? I don't think we ended up addressing that.
Oh, sorry, I think I might have missed that. But yeah, so yeah, could you answer that also?
Sure. I think that our points prevented is probably the best way that is the closest we've come to trying to get a DPR analog. Yeah, so we're still trying to figure out good ways to quantify defense, and it's really year specific. But I think looking at some of the things that we did in 2019 is probably the best way to do it. We also, at competitions, we some of the, especially some of the strategy mentors will take a look. We give them the output of our driver ability, and they'll try and relate that to an actual point impact in each match. So that's how we do figure out weights for defense based on that as well. But these are all these are all just approximations that we use for pickability and stuff. But yeah, I would say that the points prevented is the closest we've come to figuring out a DPR alternative.
Yep, thank you, Kevin, on that question. So yeah. So do you guys have anything other than that you want to add?
Yeah, I'm just going to say that if you do have any other questions after this, you can shoot us an email at softwarescouting@citruscircuits.org. We're happy to answer any questions that people have. There's also our white paper. You can find it at citruscircuits.org/scouting, or we also do white paper releases on Chief Delphi, where we've answered questions that other people in the community have had. So that's another resource. Then there are also a couple of other scouting related resources. 1114's done some great presentations on it, and the Compass Alliance also has some good information.
Thank you, Kevin. Moody, do you want to add anything also?
No, I think that covered it pretty well.
So I think that's about it, wrap for this presentation. So if you guys want, you can sign off. Sure. Right. We'll be just ending the stream right now. So
all right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us. It was a great time presenting.
Yeah.
So viewers, so with that presentation, our streaming time on Energy has come to an end. We thank all the guests and viewers who have tuned into the presentation during the last 2 hours. But don't log off yet, because there are still presentations running on the other 3 24 hours of STEM streams. And those streams are going to be Challenge, Mass, and Mentors Without Borders. So with a goodbye, au revoir, Zai Xian, auf Wiedersehen, and farewells in all other languages, Team 503 Frog Force signs off. Thank you.